Donald Trump's allies at the Kennedy Center were told by a federal judge that this institution is governed by law, not presidential preference. Then, according to a new court filing, the board voted to put Trump's name back on the building anyway. That matters because this is not simply a fight over lettering on a facade. It is a test of whether political appointees entrusted with a national memorial can use that institution to honor the president who helped put them in power, even after a court has warned them about their legal and fiduciary obligations. And the record we need to examine is unusually specific. An August 13th board meeting, a proposed inscription, a congressional statute, a judge's earlier decision, and the documents the plaintiff now wants to obtain. Start with what Representative Joyce Beatty's side says happened. Beatty, an Ohio Democrat who brought the lawsuit after a dispute over her position as an ex officio trustee, says the Kennedy Center board met on August 13th and returned to an issue that should already have been extraordinarily sensitive, putting Donald Trump's name on the Kennedy Center. According to the filing described in the source material, Trump himself phoned into that meeting. That does not by itself establish that he ordered anyone to vote a particular way, but politically and institutionally, it matters. The president whose name was being considered was apparently participating in the meeting where people appointed to oversee the institution were discussing how that name might appear, and then came the resolution. According to the text presented from that resolution, the board described the Kennedy Center as being in dire financial condition and losing $100 million a year. It credited Trump with raising hundreds of millions of dollars and described his stature as a developer as important to the center's financial future. On that basis, the resolution proposed an inscription beneath the Kennedy Center's existing name, recognizing that it had been restored and renovated by President Donald J. Trump. It reportedly went further. If another fundraising threshold were reached, additional language involving a Trump Kennedy Center fund could be added. Notice what has happened already. The argument is no longer simply that Trump likes seeing his name on buildings. The board put forward an institutional justification. Their position, at least as reflected in this resolution, is essentially that Trump is helping rescue and renovate a troubled cultural institution and therefore deserves recognition. That is the defense we have to take seriously. But it immediately runs into the legal question Beatty's lawyers put before the court. The Kennedy Center is not a private hotel. It is not a Trump property where the owner can simply decide what belongs over the entrance. It exists under a federal statutory framework, and the filing points to language in federal law restricting additional memorials or memorial-style plaques in the public areas of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Beatty's argument is that changing the wording around Trump's name does not solve that problem. Calling something recognition for restoration rather than a memorial does not necessarily change what it is. That distinction is crucial because political power often operates through labels. Call something a renovation inscription instead of a memorial. Call it recognition instead of renaming. Call it fundraising instead of personal glorification. None of those labels automatically determines the legal answer. The relevant question is what the board actually authorized, what the statute actually permits, and what the judge's previous ruling actually requires. And this is the first major payoff in the record. The dispute is not based merely on somebody predicting that Trump might someday try to rename the Kennedy Center. Beatty's filing says there was an actual August 13th vote authorizing new Trump-related language on the facade and grounds. Her lawyers characterized that move as a breathtaking act of defiance and argued that inserting phrases like restored and renovated by does not create a lawful route around the earlier decision. That is an allegation made by the plaintiff, not yet a final judicial determination about this new resolution, but it transforms the story from speculation into a concrete legal dispute over an action the board allegedly took. So, apply a simple consistency test. If a board overseeing a national memorial dedicated to another president voted to place the sitting president's name prominently on that institution after the president participated in the meeting, what standard should apply regardless of which party controlled the White House? Because the next piece makes that question harder. Judge Christopher Cooper had already focused on the trustee's responsibilities. The source describes his earlier intervention in terms of fiduciary duties. Loyalty, prudence, and decision-making in the public interest. That becomes especially important because this fight is happening alongside a much larger decision about the Kennedy Center itself, a plan that could halt programming during an extensive renovation. And according to the plaintiff's account, the evidentiary foundation presented to the board for that enormous decision may have been remarkably thin. The filing seeks discovery involving a presentation from Delta Consulting Group. The source describes the substantive material supporting the shutdown recommendation as effectively 2 pages once introductory material, title pages, and biographical information are removed. It also says that material was given to the board only 2 days before its decision. Beatty's side wants the underlying emails, text messages, correspondence, and testimony that could show how the recommendation was developed and how seriously alternatives were considered. That does not prove the renovation plan is unnecessary. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary and a figure involved with the Kennedy Center, publicly offered a straightforward defense. He said the building has serious age-related problems, including issues involving safety, air conditioning, elevators, and water. He described Trump's objective as making the Performing Arts Center exceptional again. That is a legitimate argument to investigate. Old public buildings require repairs. Large renovations can be disruptive. Sometimes closing a facility entirely is more practical, safer, or less expensive than trying to renovate it while maintaining normal operations. But that defense creates an evidentiary obligation. If shutting down a major national performing arts institution for an extended period is genuinely the prudent option, there should be a record capable of demonstrating why. What alternatives were considered? What would phase construction cost? Which safety problems prevent continued programming? What engineering analysis supports complete closure? What financial assumptions were used? How much time did trustees have to examine those conclusions? Those are not partisan questions. They are governance questions. And this is where a story that initially looks almost comical, Trump's name, giant letters, a facade, a tarp, becomes much more serious. The name dispute and the renovation dispute point toward the same underlying issue: whether trustees are independently exercising judgment for the institution or simply ratifying what the president wants. We do not yet have evidence proving the second explanation. That distinction matters. Beatty's lawyers want discovery precisely because they believe the communications behind these decisions could answer it. Emails and text messages may support their theory. They may also undermine it. Until those materials are produced, anyone claiming to know exactly what happened privately is moving beyond the evidence. But asking for those records makes sense because the sequence already creates a legitimate question. Trump reportedly participated by phone in the August 13th meeting. The board then approved language honoring Trump. The board was simultaneously dealing with consequential renovation decisions, and all of this occurred while litigation was already underway concerning the Kennedy Center, its governance, and the use of Trump's name. That is why discovery could become far more consequential than the inscription itself. If you only saw the proposed wording, you could reasonably conclude this was a petty political fight over a building. Once you see the statute, the previous court intervention, the board vote, and the demand for internal communications, the claim becomes much more precise. And repeating the most dramatic interpretation before checking those layers creates an easy credibility problem. Somebody else gets the political benefit of your outrage while you inherit the burden of defending an overstated claim. Don't get played. The evidence discipline for American politics is a complete verification system for catching exactly that problem. It applies beyond this controversy to the next clip, filing, poll, or statistic. The complete digital ebook is only $9 one time. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. Because the internal record Beatty is seeking could determine whether this was independent governance or something very different. Now look at what the plaintiff actually wants, not another round of television arguments. Discovery, emails, text messages, correspondence, depositions, the underlying consulting material, communications involving people connected to the board and administration. That is the point where political narratives become testable. The plaintiff's theory is essentially that the board has not been acting with the independence and prudence required of trustees. Internal communications could reveal whether trustees debated the legal risks, challenged the renovation assumptions, considered alternatives, or raised concerns about attaching Trump's name to the institution. They could also show the opposite, a serious process in which trustees independently evaluated the evidence and concluded that the proposals served the Kennedy Center. That is why discovery matters more than speculation about motives. The source material predicts that Judge Cooper may permit discovery, hold an evidentiary hearing, consider another injunction, and potentially block implementation of the naming resolution while the dispute proceeds. But those are predictions by the commentator whose material we are analyzing. They are not rulings that have already happened. Keeping that distinction clear is essential. What we can say is that Beatty's side told the court that implementation would not occur immediately. The source describes written commitments delaying implementation, with August 27th initially mentioned and September 8th later reported. That delay gives the litigation room to operate before a potentially difficult-to-reverse physical change occurs. And think about why that matters. Once a name is physically installed on a national institution, the political fact changes even if a court later orders it removed. There are photographs. Ceremonies can occur. Supporters can describe removal as an attack. Opponents can describe installation as an abuse. The legal question gets wrapped inside a political spectacle. A temporary pause prevents the spectacle from outrunning the law. That is not the same as deciding Beatty ultimately wins. It means the judiciary can examine whether the board has the legal authority to do what it voted to do before the disputed action becomes a physical reality. And there is another important distinction. The board's argument about Trump helping raise money may be relevant to whether trustees believe recognition is deserved. It does not necessarily answer whether Congress permits that form of recognition. Those are separate questions. A donor can be important, a president can facilitate fundraising, a renovation can be beneficial, trustees can sincerely appreciate those contributions. None of that automatically gives the board authority that a federal statute withholds. This is one of the easiest political mistakes to make, substituting a justification for legal authority. We have a good reason is not the same sentence as we have the power. If Congress established a memorial and restricted what can be installed in its public spaces, the board cannot simply erase those restrictions by deciding its preferred inscription is deserved. On the other hand, the board may argue that the proposed language is not the kind of additional memorial prohibited by the statute. That legal interpretation has to be tested through the actual text, prior orders, and the specific nature of the proposed installation. That is the strongest fair version of the dispute. Not Trump obviously can do anything he wants, and not every mention of Trump is automatically illegal. The real argument is about statutory meaning and institutional authority. So, which should matter more? The board's stated purpose for the inscription, or the legal character of what it actually places on a congressionally established memorial? A judge may ultimately have to answer that. But the fiduciary question is different and potentially broader. A trustee does not merely ask, "Can I technically get away with this?" Fiduciary responsibility involves exercising judgment for the institution. If trustees knew the naming proposal would trigger another legal battle, potentially consume institutional resources, deepen political conflict around the Kennedy Center, and collide with an existing court dispute, they would need to explain why pursuing it served the center's interests. The same applies to the shutdown decision. If a complete closure really is necessary, the record should show why. If the board received extensive engineering and financial analysis that simply was not described in the material we have, that could materially strengthen its defense. If, however, the decisive recommendation truly rested on only a tiny amount of substantive analysis delivered shortly before the vote, the prudence question becomes much more difficult. That is why the consulting presentation matters. 2 pages can occasionally contain a decisive conclusion backed by extensive work elsewhere. Page count alone proves almost nothing. A sophisticated engineering analysis could be summarized in 2 pages for a board, while detailed supporting work exists separately. So the question is not really, was it only 2 pages? The question is, what was behind those pages? What inspections were performed? What alternatives were evaluated? What cost estimates existed? Who commissioned the analysis? What assumptions were given to the consultants? Did trustees receive supporting documents? Were objections raised? Was phased renovation seriously considered? That is the evidence that can separate a responsible board decision from a predetermined political outcome, and there is a human consequence that can disappear beneath the legal language. The Kennedy Center exists to present programming to the public. A lengthy shutdown does not only affect trustees, politicians, or lawyers. It affects performers, employees, contractors, audiences, artistic organizations, and people whose livelihoods or access to cultural programming depend on the institution. That does not mean the building must remain open if safety or construction realities require closure. It means the burden of proving the necessity of closure should be taken seriously because real people carry the consequences. This is precisely where builder-in-chief rhetoric is inadequate. Lutnick can praise Trump's development experience. He can say the president wants to make the building glorious, but trustees responsible for a public institution need something more durable than confidence in one politician's instincts. They need evidence. And if that sounds like an unfair standard for Trump, reverse the names. Imagine a Democratic president participating in a board meeting of a national memorial. Imagine political allies on that board voting to add language prominently celebrating that president. Imagine an existing court dispute about the name. Imagine a congressionally enacted statute restricting memorial additions. Would Republicans accept the president raised money and thinks this is the right thing to do as the end of the inquiry? They almost certainly would not, and they should not. The same standard has to survive a change in political identity, or it is not much of a standard. Now we arrive at what may become the strongest evidence in this entire case, and paradoxically, it is evidence we do not yet have: the private communications. Public resolutions are polished. Public interviews are polished. Court filings are advocacy documents. but contemporaneous emails and messages can reveal what decision makers were actually discussing before they knew every sentence might become part of litigation. Again, discovery is not proof of wrongdoing. That cannot be emphasized enough. A demand for text messages does not mean incriminating text messages exist. A deposition request does not mean a witness lied. An allegation that the board acted as Trump's instrument does not establish that allegation, but discovery could test it. Did board members discuss whether Trump personally wanted his name restored? Did anyone warn that the proposal might conflict with the statute or the court's decision? Did trustees debate the optics and institutional consequences? Did the administration pressure them? Did members object privately but vote differently publicly? Or do the communications show an ordinary governance process in which trustees independently reach the same conclusion? Those are radically different stories. And unlike partisan speculation, they are potentially distinguishable through evidence. That is why the next phase matters more than another round of outrage about the facade. The Kennedy Center dispute has become a miniature demonstration of how accountability is supposed to function when political power intersects with a public institution. Congress writes a statute. Trustees exercise delegated authority. The executive branch has influence. A plaintiff challenges the conduct. A federal court interprets the law. Discovery can expose the factual basis for disputed decisions. Appeals can test the judge's legal conclusions. No participant gets to declare the final answer simply because they hold the most powerful office. That point matters beyond Donald Trump. Presidents naturally want institutions to reflect their priorities. Political appointees naturally understand who appointed them. Boards naturally develop relationships with donors and powerful officials. The protection against those incentives is not assuming everyone will behave perfectly. It is structure, statutes, fiduciary obligations, transparent records, judicial review, and the possibility that internal decisions will eventually have to be defended under oath. The Kennedy Center case tests whether those structures still have force when the person whose interests may benefit is the president himself. And there is an argument on the other side worth hearing. Trump's defenders can say the president is trying to rehabilitate a deteriorating institution, secure funding, solve physical problems that predecessors neglected, and make the Kennedy Center financially sustainable. They can argue that recognizing the person responsible for a major restoration is ordinary institutional practice rather than an attempt to replace John F. Kennedy's memorial. That argument should not be mocked, it should be tested. Show the financial records supporting the claimed losses, show the renovation analysis, show the statutory basis for the inscription, show the board deliberations, show how trustees evaluated the conflict created by honoring a sitting president who participated in the meeting. Show why this form of recognition is consistent with the earlier court decision. If that evidence exists and supports the board, it deserves to be acknowledged. But if the response is essentially that Trump deserves the honor because Trump helped the center and the board says so, then the central legal problem remains untouched. Power cannot be its own authorization. And that brings us back to the tarp. In the source material, Beatty's side alleges that a tarp remained over the building and describes the justification for keeping it there as pretextual, arguing that it prevented restoration of the pre-litigation status quo. That is the plaintiff's characterization. We do not have enough material here to independently establish why every portion of that covering remained in place. But politically, the image is almost too perfect. A national memorial named for one president, a dispute about adding another president's name, a physical covering obscuring the facade while lawyers fight over what can legally appear there. The symbolism is powerful, but symbolism cannot substitute for evidence. The evidence we have establishes that there is a real legal fight, a board resolution described in court filings, a statutory dispute, an earlier judicial intervention, and a plaintiff seeking deeper discovery. It does not establish that every accusation against Trump or the trustees is true. It does not establish what undisclosed communications contain. And it does not tell us what Judge Cooper will ultimately decide about this latest resolution. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the investigation. It is the boundary separating what we know from what somebody wants us to believe. And politically, that boundary may be the most important part of this entire story, because Trump's name is not really the ultimate issue. The ultimate issue is whether the people controlling a public institution can transform presidential influence into institutional tribute without demonstrating that the law permits it and that their decision serves the institution they are obligated to protect. If the board can demonstrate both, then its defense becomes substantially stronger. If it cannot, the inscription becomes evidence of something much more troubling than bad taste. It becomes a governance problem, public authority exercised for a purpose that may not belong to the institution at all, and the renovation decision follows the same logic. A president saying a building needs to be glorious does not establish that a 2-year shutdown is prudent. A consultant presentation does not establish necessity merely because it exists. Trustees have to evaluate the underlying evidence. Courts do not run performing arts centers, but courts can examine whether officials acted within legal boundaries. That is the institutional dividing line. And consider the precedent. Every president eventually leaves office. Every administration eventually becomes somebody else's opposition. If the standard becomes that a president may surround himself with political allies on public boards, participate in decisions involving his own recognition, and rely on those boards to reinterpret statutory limits in his favor, people cheering that arrangement today may find it intolerable when another president uses the same model tomorrow. That is why the reverse party test is so useful here. Would you accept this process if you despise the person whose name was being installed? If the answer changes with the name, the standard is political loyalty, not institutional principle. So where does this leave the case? The strongest conclusion supported by the material is narrower and more serious than the loudest rhetoric surrounding it. The Kennedy Center Board reportedly approved a resolution that would again place Donald Trump's name on the institution in connection with renovation and fundraising. Beatty's lawyers argue that doing so conflicts with the Kennedy Center's governing statute and defies the court's earlier decision. The plaintiff is seeking discovery into the board's deliberations and the evidence supporting major renovation decisions. Trump's allies defend the renovation effort as necessary to repair an aging institution and portray his involvement as beneficial to its future. What remains unknown is exactly what happened behind closed doors. We do not know from this record whether trustees were privately pressured. We do not know what the complete renovation analysis contains. We do not know whether internal communications will support Beatty's theory or the board's defense. And we do not yet know how the court will resolve the legality of the latest naming proposal. But we do know who had responsibility. The trustees had a responsibility to the Kennedy Center, not simply to the president. Congress established the legal framework. The court has authority to interpret the law and determine whether challenged actions fall within it. And Trump, because his own name and political influence are at the center of the dispute, cannot erase the conflict merely by insisting that his plans would improve the building. The next decisive development, therefore, should not be another boast, another insult, or another political slogan. It should be evidence. Show the communications, show the analysis, show the legal authority, show the deliberative process. Then the public can distinguish renovation from rationalization, recognition from self-promotion, and independent trusteeship from political obedience. That is the question this case began with, and the evidence has now made it sharper. When a president's personal legacy collides with a public institution's statutory limits, who actually wins? The president's preference or the rules governing the institution? The court may soon provide part of that answer. The records behind the board's decisions may provide the rest. And another political clip, court filing, poll, accusation, or official explanation will soon ask you to reach a conclusion before all of its context reaches you. When that happens, somebody else can choose the frame and borrow your certainty for political advantage, or you can become the person who finds the missing piece before repeating the claim. Don't Get Played gives you a complete practical method for doing that across clips, polls, court filings, statistics, official statements, and synthetic media. The digital ebook costs only $9 as a one-time payment. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. A political reaction is easy. A conclusion you can defend requires evidence.